Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D as the kids call it, is a tabletop role-playing game that allows players to explore fantasy realms, slay monsters, and avoid talking to those of the opposite gender for indefinite periods of time. They do this through conversation and imagination, conjuring up fantastical situations in their minds, and tying it all down with an Excel spreadsheet equivalent in rules and instructions. I look like an idiot. Actually, D&D's become pretty accessible in recent years, at least for anyone near a Barnes & Noble, and because of shows like Stranger Things, at least everyone's heard of the game. In 2023, there was even a blockbuster movie released based entirely in and on the lore of Dungeons & Dragons. But even if you haven't heard of it, or would never be caught dead holding a 20-sided die, you've still probably seen or played something that took inspiration from the game. D&D has become truly synonymous with nerd culture, and if you're ever to find yourself at a convention or even just your local gaming store, you're bound to stumble across some campaign. However, in the not-so-distant past, Dungeons & Dragons was not looked upon so kindly by the public. The game was seen as dangerous, a gateway to dark demonic forces, and the players were seen as Satanists, practitioners of the occult, being led astray into the clutches of evil. But before we get into any of that, if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does mean a lot. To understand the whole story of the Satanic Panic surrounding D&D, we need to actually look back to about a decade before the controversy began to pretty much the inception of the game. Dungeons & Dragons was birthed out of an equally nerdy gaming genre called miniature war gaming. These are games where two players control whole armies and battle each other with a referee overseeing to make sure the gameplay is smooth and realistic. This genre actually dates all the way back to the 1880s, where guys would line up miniatures on a table, come up with a rule set, and start testing their military prowess against each other. But over time, these rule sets were actually developed until they became very legitimate strategic games. This was all well and good, but by the latter half of the 20th century, miniature war gaming was being experimented with more intensely than ever. In 1971, a game called Chainmail, created by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin, was released. This game took the rules and stylings of miniature war gaming, but it put it into a medieval context. Even more importantly, Gygax also created a supplementary rule set for Chainmail that had a twist to it. He created rules that allowed for the use of Tolkien-inspired creatures like dragons and trolls within the game, as well as a new rule set and instructions on how to use magic. Alongside the development of Chainmail in 1969, Gary Gygax also met and became friends with Dave Arneson. Arneson had actually been working on his own war games that sought to allow for more than 2 players at a time. He did this by creating other roles like mayors and citizens of towns who had their own goals not related directly to the conflict of the game. These new roles were focused far more on individual gameplay rather than commanding whole battalions at a time. After befriending Gygax, Arneson would create his own rule set and game world based around Chainmail, but this version would stray even further from its wargaming roots. In the fantasy world of Blackmoor, players all took control of individual characters and carried those characters over from session to session, gaining levels along the way. Arneson showed his new concept to Gygax, and together they attempted to get it published as a brand new title. However, Gygax's current employers, Guidon Games, rejected the whole role-playing concept that had totally taken the focus away from the strategic battles traditionally known within wargaming. So instead, the duo created their own studio called Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR for short. Editing me here, it turns out Arneson was not actually one of the founders of TSR. There's a lot of history here, but I'll simplify really quick. Gygax considered the creation of D&D to be the product of many, ultimately overseen, completed, and brought to market by himself. He did co-found TSR with other business people, but not with Arneson. On the other hand, Arneson considered his contributions to be the spark that made the game what it was, and so he did go work for TSR. Ultimately, there would be a falling out and a lawsuit between the two, but that's really a story for another time, so let's get back into it. And in 1974, they released their new game, Dungeons & Dragons. The early game was simple compared to today's, and it only contained 3 classes, the Fighting Man, Magic User, and Cleric. It took time to iron out some of the kinks within the original gameplay, but as they did so, Gygax and Arneson also began releasing other rule sets along the way. These would add further complexity and possibilities for the players. The most important of these early supplements, for the sake of this video, is one titled Eldritch Wizardry. This was a 60-page document that included tons of new elements that enhanced gameplay. These included a druid subclass, psionic abilities, and new creatures like the Mind Flayer. Most importantly, this supplement was the first time demons were ever mentioned within Dungeons & Dragons. This was the supplement that added stuff like Orcus and Demogorgon, both of which share names with Princes of Hell within demonology. D&D had now added a race and characters into the game that were believed in and associated with evil by many across the globe. Although the public didn't take immediate notice to this, it was really only a matter of time before it stirred up some sort of controversy. TSR would push the envelope again in 1977 with the release of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, which included a new race called Devils. Obviously, the name of this race just further alludes to real-world beliefs in evil, and some of the names that they gave to devil characters definitely don't help either. These include Mephistopheles, who's probably the most famous demon in fiction, Moloch, who is an ancient pagan deity mentioned multiple times in the Hebrew Bible, and Azazel, who is the name of a demon and even Satan himself within certain Abrahamic traditions. It should be noted that many other pieces of legends, folklore, mythology, religion were used within D&D systems, but the devils and demons were definitely the most provocative for the time. Yet, even with this newest inclusion, the game didn't really receive a great deal of controversy. This was mainly because it was so niche, and most of the people who played it probably weren't going to be willing to admit they played it. And so the game slowly grew in popularity over the next few years, spreading through middle schools, high schools, and colleges alike, attracting nerdy kids from across the US. This steady growth would go on until 1979, when the impending controversy would suddenly strike. Okay, so this next part is going to deal with some heavier topics, but they're very important to the story of this entire controversy, so I am going to cover them. I'm not going to go into detail about any of the heavy stuff, but I am going to take off the hat, and I'll put it back on later. James Dallas Egbert III was a child prodigy already attending Michigan State University at the age of 16. On August 15th, 1979, he left an apparent suicide note in his room and vanished from campus. The police launched an investigation, and on August 22nd, Egbert's parents hired a private investigator named William Deere to assist in the case. They discovered from friends of James that he would often disappear for unknown amounts of time to unknown places, but they also discovered that he had a habit for wandering around and exploring the steam tunnels underneath the university. Deere searched deep into the tunnels and found evidence that James had been there, but not James himself. It was also learned through the investigation that James was a big fan of Dungeons & Dragons, and William Deere latched onto this piece of information intensely. You see, James had actually mapped the steam tunnels beneath campus out in his room using pushpins, and Deere interpreted this pushpin map to also be some kind of game board for Dungeons & Dragons. He then extrapolated that Egbert was some fanatic fan of D&D and somehow thought his powers were real and was attempting to practice magic in the steam tunnels at night. Even though there weren't any D&D related items in Egbert's room, when Deere released this theory to the press, they went wild with it. The disappearance became national news, and the leading theory surrounding it was an obscure, esoteric board game that no one could really understand. Because other kids on campus were too scared now to come forward and talk to the police about the game, they began to view it like it was some sort of secret cult, and the media magnified this perspective tenfold. The story started shifting. People began to believe that the note Egbert had left was actually a fake and he'd been abducted by Satanists. William Deere, for his part, continually sensationalized the game to the media, who had now come to view him as some sort of expert on Dungeons & Dragons, even though it doesn't seem like he understood even the basic rules of the game. He actually believed that the secret to finding Egbert involved decoding clues from inside of the game's instructions, so he was pretty much wasting his time. TSR was contacted for comment, but even when they tried to explain the game in as simple of terms as possible, it did very little to curb all the false headlines. Then, after almost a month of national attention, Egbert reappeared. It turned out he had actually fled after his plan failed and ended up in Louisiana. His stay there was not pleasant and involved another attempt on his life, and ultimately he contacted Deere and was quietly returned to his family. William Deere would never come out to the media and admit that D&D played like no role in this disappearance case, and he would actually never admit that he was wrong about anything at all. Eventually, in 1984, releasing a book about the incident called Dungeon Master. The truth of this whole situation was far more simple than any demonic cults or rituals. It was a matter of mental health. Egbert was known to struggle with depression, anxiety, drug use, and according to Deere himself, his sexual identity. He was a troubled kid, and he was put under an immense amount of pressure through his enrollment in university. I also want to note here that about a year later, in 1980, James's struggle with mental health would come to an end when he would take his life at the age of 17. I bring this up because the end of this story, while sad, fully explains the whole situation. This was a story about a young kid who was struggling heavily, and the media turned it into a circus, all focused on some stupid board game. I know that's a downer way to end this part, but it's the truth, and it's a truth that I don't think usually gets the attention that it deserves when most people cover this story. I kind of think James Dallas Egbert III deserves to be covered in a way that is humanizing to him, not just him as a prop in this story about the media attacking role-playing games. In 1981, the book Hobgoblin was released. This was a horror novel that was meant to capitalize on the sensational media coverage of the Egbert case, or the steam tunnels incident as it had become known. In that same year, another book called Mazes and Monsters was released. This was a work of fiction based directly on the steam tunnels incident, but where all the crazy theories about Dungeons and Dragons are true. A year after that, on December 28th, 1982, a made-for-TV adaptation was released. Strangely, this is Tom Hanks' first ever lead role. I watched it. It's bad. You don't have to watch it. Tom Hanks does go crazy and almost jumps off the Twin Towers, but other than that, it's horrible.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Unfortunately, on June 9th, 1982, another young man named Irving Lee Pulling would take his life at the age of 17. Irving was an avid fan of role-playing games, and although his fellow students said that he definitely struggled with a great many things, in the wake of the steam tunnels incident, his parents just blamed it all on Dungeons and Dragons. This would lead his mother, Patricia Pulling, to first file a lawsuit against her son's school for allowing him to play D&D on campus, before suing TSR themselves for publishing the game. Both of these lawsuits would be thrown out, but this would mark the beginning of the Patricia Pulling warpath. In 1983, Pulling founded BAD, or Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, I'm gonna put back on the hat because the bad stuff is pretty wacky. Pulling made it her mission to destroy the reputation and ultimately the revenue of Dungeons & Dragons, mainly by repeating the same talking points over and over again to anyone who would listen. She preached that D&D was a game primarily centered on, demonology, rape, witchcraft, murder, suicide, homosexuality, prostitution, and cannibalism, among other things. Pat did manage to have her voice heard every now and then on mainstream news networks, but she found even more success through Christian media outlets. This allowed her to build the bad name into general relevancy within Christian and conservative circles throughout the 80s. She actually went about getting her own private investigator's license and became a consultant to the police. She also became an expert witness on lawsuits against role-playing games. All of which lost, of course, but you know. Pulling would also co-author a book titled The Devil's Web: Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan? Like most of the people involved in this story, she had absolutely no real knowledge about D&D or role-playing, but she saw that it talked about demons and spells, so it was clearly evil. She talks about the Necronomicon without seeming to know that it is quite literally a fictional book made up by H.P. Lovecraft. She also encouraged law enforcement to interrogate suspected Satanists by asking if they're into role-playing. Patricia became the face of the movement against Dungeons & Dragons throughout the 80s, and she garnered a pretty dedicated group of people around her, mainly other moms, some of whom had pretty sad similar stories to her own. She also managed to galvanize a pretty serious distrust toward role-playing games that exists in certain Christian circles to this day. However, as time went on, Pulling's claims just didn't hold up to scrutiny. Her outrageous statements, like saying that 8% of Richmond, Virginia's population were Satanists, made no sense, sounded crazy, and had no data to back it up. She also claimed things like being involved in hundreds of cases surrounding Satanists and D&D, but they were all part of confidential police files, so she could never talk about them publicly. Then, amongst all the misinformation and falsehoods, one man took a stand for truth. Michael A. Stackpole was a game designer and aspiring author who was greatly troubled by the claims made by Bad and Patricia Pulling, so he launched an investigation of his own. He was able to easily disprove the claim that role-playing fans were at any higher risk of suicide or dangerous activities. By simply looking at publicly available numbers, he began publishing these facts as early as 1982. As the nagging voice of Bad continued to grow, he became more and more vocal until 1990 when he released the Pulling Report. This was an almost 20,000 word long dissertation breaking down each individual case that was alleged to have connection to D&D and proving that there was no legal evidence to that claim. He also went about dismantling the various claims made throughout Pulling's book, and exposed that much of the information she was touting about the game was far outdated and incorrect when referring to modern editions of Dungeons & Dragons. This could have been a bombshell, and it was a big deal within the role-playing community. But the D&D panic had actually just largely ended because the media had stopped reporting on it and had begun fear-mongering about video games, so everyone was scared of them now.
As ABC's Bill Greenwood reports, there is a growing concern on Capitol Hill that parents who buy some of those games may not realize just how much violence they're getting.
The Pulling Report did provide a way for tabletop RPG players to poke holes in the arguments of those trying to criticize the genre from a moral standpoint, and because Pulling herself refused to adapt or improve even after being so rightly criticized, Bad started to have a whole lot more bark than bite. After the year 1992, no more major publications even put Dungeons & Dragons in their headlines, and the panic was completely over. In 1997, Patricia Pulling would die, and with her final breath, Bad would breathe its last too. Her legacy has made it so that a general distrust toward RPGs still does exist in certain circles, but with all of her claims disproven, her lasting damage is minimal. And that is kinda sorta the end of the Satanic Panic. Whew, that was ugly. But what happened to D&D through all this bad press? Well, in 1979, before the whole panic thing, the game did about $2.3 million in sales. By that same time next year, that number more than tripled, with D&D selling more than $8.5 million worth. And it only went up from there. As more and more people were exposed to the game, more and more people bought it. No matter the context, or maybe because of it, this new rebellious action of playing role-playing games and acting out fantasy situations exploded. TSR did change the names of demons and devils to the Batezu and the Tanari, and their millennium-year-long war became a much larger focus of their lore over their seduction and killing of mortals. For a long time, the D words were a big no-no around TSR, but after being purchased by Wizards of the Coast and developing D&D 3rd edition, the term slowly crept back in. The fan base, for their part, had been calling them demons and devils the entire time, so like I mentioned at the beginning, D&D is bigger than ever now. Critical Role, a Twitch channel where real voice actors stream their campaigns, is actually the highest earning channel on Twitch via subs and bit donations. They've even had one of their campaigns adapted into an animated show for Amazon Prime, so they're pretty popular. The whole Satanic Panic is a small part of gaming history as a whole, but I find it really fascinating. There's so much more nuance to it, and there's so many little details I wasn't able to cover, on top of all of the conflicting information about some of the events I've mentioned. But I hope I was able to give a generally comprehensive timeline and explain the reasons for the beginning and end of the panic. If you've watched this far and you've liked the video, feel free to give it a like. And if you want to see more stuff like this in the future, I have more stuff planned. So why don't you subscribe too? Anyways, until then, bye.